Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take a few seconds to let everybody get into the room, and then we'll start. Okay, I think we probably have the bulk of everyone, at least everybody who's on time. So welcome to our webinar today. I'm Elizabeth Gamotz. I am NAICU's Chief Operating Officer, and I am really pleased to have you all with us and to have Perlmeyer with us today for this webinar on Beyond the Metrics, building a thoughtful evaluation process for presidential performance and evaluating leadership for sustainability. So we are very proud to have Perlmeyer with us. They are a longtime partner of NAICU's, and more importantly, longtime dedicated supporters of the private higher education sector. And with us today is Alexander Yaffe and Peter Thies, who are both managing directors with Perlmeyer, and each of whom bring a wealth of personal and professional experience to these topics. They each founded their own firms, specializing in compensation and leadership consulting. And they also each have some personal background in their education backgrounds coming from our institutions, from private higher education. So they really understand what you do and how to support you in that work. A couple of mechanics for today's webinar. We will be recording this, and it will be available along with the slides on our website following the meeting, shortly following the meeting. We'll also be pushing that out to the full membership in Washington Update next Friday, so you don't have to worry about trying to capture the screens. And both Peter and Alexander really very much hope this will be as much of a conversation as possible. So we're going to utilize the tools that we have. Please use the Q&A if you have any questions for Alexander and Peter. Put your questions in there. That will allow other attendees to see what's on your mind and to upvote any questions so that we can make sure to capture as many of those as possible. And also, Peter and Alexander will probably be asking you some questions, and they will use the chat function for that. So please feel free to respond there. So with that, I will turn it over with our thanks and appreciation to Alexander and Peter.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Really appreciate that introduction, and it is a pleasure for us to be doing this today. Appreciate everyone who could join us, and I'm really very enthusiastic about doing this with Peter. As Elizabeth mentioned, he is one of my colleagues in the leadership practice here at Perlmeyer, where I focus more so on executive compensation. We both cross paths in dealing with performance evaluation, and we come from it from different perspectives. And so really looking forward to walking through all of this with you and really being able to hear Peter's point of view on some of these topics to hopefully help all of your institutions improve their performance evaluation process and their approach to governing these important matters. What you see here are the sort of 5 key areas that we're going to touch on today. I think that higher education finds itself today in a highly volatile place for a variety of reasons, both things that we've seen coming and things that are relatively new. How an institution embraces that and deals with it is becoming an increasingly important question among our clients and those with which we engage, because presidential performance evaluation is so critical to not only today, but where the institution is headed tomorrow, and really making sure that you have, as an institution, a sound approach to considering both internal and external factors. So with that, I think we can dive right in. I don't think that any of this is going to be a surprise to those of you on this webinar. You, as leaders of private colleges and universities, are leading through, and I know I've said this in the past, but what feels like an unprecedented time of change and uncertainty. We have seen declining enrollments. We all know about the fear of the enrollment cliff, intensifying competition. Systems and models are changing among institutions as they move towards mergers, affiliations, and addressing digital transformation. pressure from parents and students, regulators and legislators. And so there's just less room for error and a lot more coming at you quickly, not to mention AI, things occurring at the Department of Education, and the like. And so presidents are facing challenges that, for many of them, particularly those that may have come through academia, they probably did not anticipate when they started on the leadership track towards a presidency. Thinking about how to grow revenue through new programs, expanding access and focusing on equity, and thinking about what institutional resilience looks like with unanticipated factors and issues coming at you. These are not small tasks. And you want to be able to ideally try your best to anticipate these things and not leave them to chance. And so today we're hoping to try to open the door to ways in which you might reconsider or reevaluate your performance evaluation process in light of all of this. The role of the presidency is getting more challenging.
Yeah, I'd say, Alexander, on this particular slide here, hopefully this resonates with those of you joining us today, that the job is not getting any easier. It's getting a lot harder. It's coming from a lot of different angles. And one of the main points you're going to hear from us throughout this webinar is that these factors, one of the implications of all these factors is that the actual leadership muscle that a president needs to show um, is rising, and meaning that all of these factors make the actual act of being a leader and their leadership style as important as many of the more traditional factors that you include in a performance evaluation. So what we're going to be talking about and giving examples of is how can you revise your existing president evaluation process to capture not only how is the institution performing, which is obviously a key factor, and how constituents are managed and the traditional measures that we've seen, but also a heightened focus on the leadership part of the job, because it's when you have contextual factors like we're looking at on this particular slide, the more those factors are at play, the more that great leadership matters.
And I would only add to that that in periods of uncertainty, uh, there is an increased premium on the ability to communicate between a board and a president. And that relationship requires an enhanced degree of trust and understanding when navigating uncertainty and unprecedented changes. It's one thing if you're sort of going along to get along and things are static and you've done this for some time. It's a different dynamic when everything around you is moving and moving quickly. And so the need to be able to engender trust, align perceptions, and really be able to have frank conversations about the challenges, the strengths, the weaknesses, etc., is shifting and reshaping performance evaluation. For those of you who may have joined the last webinar that we gave, the focus was more on incentive plan design, both annual incentive, long-term incentives, and retention incentives. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. But that's what you're getting done, whereas this is more a focus on how you're getting done, what you're getting done. And the context here is there are limits to metrics. And so we need to expand our perspective to be able to fully appreciate what it means to lead an institution.
Yeah, Alexander, we have obviously we've put on this particular slide, it's time to open the aperture up. So think of it as a camera where you're dialing up and opening up the lens so that you're looking at much more of the factors that make for effectiveness and then the requirements for effectiveness of university and institution presidents. So it's basically saying the metrics are important for sure, but it's not just about those, and opening up the aperture and opening up our view of the role of the president, and therefore the measures that you would use to include in your evaluation should reflect that opening up of the aperture. And I put in the chat the prior slide we've been talking about. We were listing a whole bunch of the factors that are affecting presidents today. We encourage you to contribute to that in the chat if you'd like, to say there are some other things that we're not even addressing yet that are factors that you're seeing that the presidents of your institutions are facing, or you as presidents are facing.
Well, I think that's an important point, Peter, because you want your evaluation process to reflect what you're dealing with. Now, granted, there are going to be things that are similar from president to president, but there are also campus and community specific issues that may affect you differently or more so than an institution down the street. And so when you think about designing this evaluation, you want to think about both the macro factors as well as the micro factors, and not be afraid to modify your evaluation. As we'll talk about as we work through this today, there are things that you're going to want to trend from year to year, but you also don't want your evaluation to become irrelevant or stale. And so being able to balance those factors at any given point in time is a part of the evaluation design process. And so, as Peter said, if you have other factors that we didn't note, not that that list was intended to be exhaustive, we certainly want to hear from all of you about what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and what you're struggling with or proud about in what you do and what you address.
Yeah, and here's a little bit of sort of the why we're making this case about opening up the aperture and why leadership behavior matters, much, as much if not more, in today's sort of VUCA world, right? We haven't used the term VUCA yet, but volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. Those four things make for a lot of things to manage. So leadership effectiveness matters, and why? It's for at least some of these reasons that we're showing here on the screen. Again, we invite you to either raise your hand in the chat if we can possibly see it, but more likely if you put it in the chat box. It matters for sustainability, especially around the culture of the institution, right? So if you have a president leading the institution that knows how to get results and knows how to get some of the financial outcomes and some of the academic outcomes that you seek, but is creating collateral damage culturally, that matters, right? That matters for the sustainability of leadership in the institution. Reputationally, right? Ethical lapses. Unfortunately, we hear stories in the corporate world as well as the academic world of things that create some collateral damage for the institution because of a lapse in judgment in one way or the other. And some might say, well, that you have social media and press that will blow things up out of proportion. That's just today's world. You have to live with the understanding that those are the kinds of things that are possible. It can affect retention if the leadership style and leadership effectiveness is not what it needs to be for the institution. And then, of course, as we've been making the point here, from a crisis management standpoint, especially in volatile times, especially when the times get tough, being agile, having some adaptability, being creative in the way you engage people, and being thoughtful in your responses as an institution to your communities and stakeholders, they all matter quite a bit. So that's why it matters now more than ever. So what we want to do here is get a little bit more specific and a little more leading towards thinking of how specifically to augment your existing process here. So it's a very well done presidential assessment would include definition around the leadership aspect of the role, as we've been saying. And so, in general, when we've done this work, not only in the academic world, but in the corporate world and the nonprofit world, we generally see four categories of it's not just leadership style, but four categories of the job of leadership that you'd want to infuse into your presidential evaluation. And you can see the four circles. They're overlapping and they're drawn that way for a reason because they kind of bleed over into each other. But you can separate them out for purposes of evaluation. But there's how strong that leader is, that president is, in strategic leadership categories. And you see on the upper right-hand side, do they reflect the mission and vision of the organization? Do they steward that? Do they enhance it? Are the boards engaged? Is the board engaged in the right way? Are stakeholders managed and dealt with in the right way? And of course, all good plans are for naught if you can't execute against those. You have about the nature of how well is the institution progressing against its strategic plan. That's the strategic leadership dimension. Um, Alexander, are there particular things that you've seen in your travels in academia and with presidents and compensation matters above and beyond what I've talked about with respect to strategy?
I would say that these kinds of factors definitely influence a board's perspective on compensation, on retention, and where things stand at a given point in time. I think that what I have found is that while many of these things, all of these things are important, they aren't all equally important all at the same time. And so you may evaluate some or all of these, but your focus in particular areas may increase or decrease depending on what's happening either internally, externally, or within a given team. But these dimensions, if you will, are certainly sort of the four key areas that we would see need to be addressed in order to get a complete picture. I would also say that as presidents transition, and one of the reasons presidential performance evaluation and doing it well is important is because we continue to see presidential tenure erode. And an institution is going to struggle being successful if their president is turning over every 2, 3, or 4 years. And so being able to look at these kind of factors, even for a planned transition, and as you search for your next president, say, what do we need in our next leader? These factors give you a roadmap to consider, not only for finding that next leader, but also evaluating internal talent for what's necessary for a given role. So it really gives you a good sort of menu of areas with those definitions you talked about to be able to say what is the right profile for our president at this time, and does the evaluation match what we need and what our expectations are of the role.
Yeah, right. And so it's questions around strategy. There's questions around how the organization runs, how the institution operates, just for operational effectiveness. Um, it's human capital. Are you having lots of turnover in the ranks? Are you having, just like you mentioned, the tenures might be getting shorter in the president role? Are you seeing department chairs turning over at an unusual rate? All
Mm-hmm.
right, that it may not be quote unquote the president's fault, but the president needs to be held accountable for having a sustainable pipeline of leaders across different parts of the organization. So
You
human
know,
capital in particular is hugely important here.
One good example I can give you that I've dealt with recently is that as leadership teams and organizational structures evolve in higher ed for a variety of reasons, we are starting to see a number of chief operating officers among the C-suite. Distinct, obviously, from a provost, but an individual that is focused on operations. Because the role of a president is very different than the role of an operator in terms of running an institution operationally. And so we have started to see institutions that have this chief operating officer role reconsider their performance evaluation to say that there should be less of a focus on operational efficiency at the presidential level. They're still holding the president accountable, but it's a bigger component of the chief operating officer's annual evaluation and less so the president because of the way in which the leadership team is evolving. And so I think that gives an example of how what we're seeing in the marketplace is impacting this on the ground.
Yeah,
I
so
think
now just as a transition point here for the group, so the slide before was about the what, like what would you measure in addition to the hard metrics that most current president evaluations might have in them in terms of organizational outcomes and KPIs and certain performance measures, fundraising, all those kinds of things. We're making the case for having that profile that is a profile of the desired leadership in the role of president for your institution. So each one can, they may have many of the same categories covered in the prior slide, but what should be done is a unique one that is tailored to your particular institution. And that use that profile as the basis for a well thought through process, which is what we're transitioning to now. So now we're going to talk about how to design the evaluation process, but we're making the assumption, even in this wheel here, which Alexander will talk more about in a moment, the designing of it, the first thing in design is what do we want to measure? What's important in the role? And why is it important? So that's what we've been trying to cover so far and make the point in our journey on this call is leadership matters. There are ways to measure leadership through different standards in a profile that would be based on those 4 circles we showed in the prior slide. And that's the input into now this process here that you see. So Alexander, back to you.
I think that's a good segue to this. I'll start with what we say at the top. And while it is the board's responsibility to evaluate the president, it is important that this be collaborative because evaluation is a partnership. Trust is so critical. And so you want to have clear expectations and you want to be able to listen to what's on the president's mind, hear what the board is looking for, and make sure that you are planning appropriately for what do we expect, what is the board's role, what is the president's role, and think through what that process is going to look like and who the individuals included are. You want to be able to lay out how this is going to flow forward. So for example, there are many institutions where the president participates as a self-evaluation, the board provides feedback. Sometimes that data is organized by committee outputs. Sometimes you may have the executive committee's evaluation highlighted separately from the full board. But the question is of constituency. And so some have now begun to ask for input from senior staff. Some have said we want to do that every year. Some have said we want to do that periodically. So it's important to think about who's going to own this process. Is it your executive committee? Is it your compensation committee? Is it another group? So who's gonna own the process? What do we expect this to look like before we start dealing with any data collection? And what's most important for us to evaluate? Because there are the things that you're going to ask about and get feedback on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the things you're asking about are of equal importance. So understanding what your categories are and how you might prioritize them is an important discussion to have because you may find differences of opinion. As I mentioned earlier, it's also important to talk about the need for year-over-year trending. I would have a lot of presidents today that would tell you that every year is different for a whole host of reasons, and to try to trend results over time produces limited value. There are others that would clearly disagree with that. And so having a perspective and an understanding of that importance is critical, as well as how you're going to gather this data. There are
Yeah,
superficial. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
yeah, Alexander. So we have a question from the audience here, and a great question here. So I think I'll choose answer this live. Um, so the question is surrounding the use of the utility of getting 360 type feedback in a presidential evaluation, because sometimes presidents have to make unpopular decisions and therefore staff may not be happy, right? So that dynamic can feed into, and therefore, in this particular participant says, my faculty are pushing for a 360-degree evaluation process, but is that actually going to be effective in measuring my actual presidential performance? Which is a terrific question to ask. And it brings up a point. So we'll get to it now. Why don't we answer it real time? So the question on the table is, should you incorporate 360-degree type feedback in an evaluation process? Our a perspective is it's useful, not necessarily every year, certainly in the first year of a president's tenure, and then probably every other year to get some more input beyond just the board would be important. We do recognize that popularity can come into play here. But that's a matter of how the results of that 360 feedback, how they are actually used. And in our view, it's best when any 360 feedback, especially from staff or faculty, it would be used not in the overall performance scorecard to say you're red, green, or yellow because of the feedback. The feedback is actually meant to be more going forward developmentally. What might the president need to work on in his or her leadership style going forward based on the feedback? So the 360 feedback would not be the predominant prevailing factor in here, but it is important to get a sense of it, because there are some, if you actually think empathetically on behalf of the president, if people are thinking and feeling this way about their leadership, but there's no way to voice it, you can't act on it. And so the board's expectation should not be that 360 feedback is quote unquote clean and rosy. It's always going to have some opportunities for improvement. But if it is used in the spirit of helping that president be more effective in his or her role, that's the point of using 360 feedback.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. I think it's an excellent question and exactly why we're here today. I would take it one step further and say that it is about how you use the information. Because the board might say, let's do a 360 evaluation, doesn't mean that all of the feedback received is going to be viewed on par with one another. It's about understanding what's being said, because presidents and boards don't like surprises. So giving the opportunity to have people voice their thoughts, even if it becomes somewhat of a complaining session, hearing it and then allows you to do something about it. But it comes down to the board and the president looking at that feedback and saying, okay, what's being said? What's the president's view on this? What's the board's view on this? And how do you work to try to address it as best you can? Not to acquiesce necessarily, but how do we want to communicate and respond? Because if you don't know about it, then you're just waiting for the pressure valve to explode. And so better to be proactive about it and be able to try to embrace it on your terms, but you need to contextualize it. And that goes back to trust and perception and conversation. It is not about being punitive, and it's not that everything that's said in the 360 is the Bible truth, because it came through a process.
And we're getting some more good input here on in the chat box too. So if we look at the chat tab here, yeah. So question is, do we see any changes in governance approaches to evaluation? You know, so let me get to the more specific question. Are there specific strategies or advice we'd offer to presidents in today's environment if they're heading into a contract negotiation for a renewal or a new position? So, Alexander, if you can field that part of that question there.
Sure. I think that it is very important. So contract renegotiation, a renewal, is very different than a new position. Um, I would say that we see with renewals, not every renewal, but often, a deeper dive into the evaluation process, at least from the board's perspective, to get more feedback from the community, perhaps external stakeholders, about perception, not necessarily performance. Because when you're talking about renewal, it's not necessarily, well, how did I do last year? It's more about where are we? What are the perceptions? What's the president's perspective? And what is the perspective of others? Because the board wants to be sure that they are renewing the contract of an individual that, one, wants to continue in the role and has the feedback to make sure everyone's on the same page, but also know a sense of the reaction that they may receive to renewing that employment agreement. I think that when you're talking about a new position, what I find is that a lot of individuals don't necessarily ask questions around the presidential evaluation process, how that works, what that looks like, and what they tend to do. They're focused on the job. They're focused on a whole bunch of things around the college or the university, as it were. But it's important to understand the board's perspective on evaluation. How do you evaluate performance? What role does the president have? From whom do you get feedback? How is that feedback shared? Because that's going to give you insight into the culture of the institution and really tell you whether that's something that you can embrace or whether that gives you pause. So given the environment we're in and given the role of presidential evaluation really being where the president and the board can engage in thoughtful discussion, as if I'm a president, I want to understand that at a more granular level and not just leave it to chance.
Yeah. There's a last part of in the chat question box is, what are the hardest elements of the evaluation criteria for boards and presidents to discuss and address? Which are the stickiest ones? So I'd like to answer that one. Alexander, if you could go back one slide to the four circles we had. So of these, if we had more time, we would do a live poll to say which of these bullet points on this slide are the quote unquote stickiest and hardest. But I can tell you from experience, it's leadership style. Can be very sticky because it can feel very judgmental. It can be based on some hearsay. That's why, in addition to 360 feedback, you want to make sure you have other measures to augment that. Another one is succession planning. Most CEOs, including presidents of universities, do not love talking about succession planning for their role because for fear of losing control of the conversation and unintentionally triggering the heightening of the end of the tenure of that president. So there's natural fear on the part of CEOs in the both public and private companies that have boards on them, but also in academic institutions. It's not the easiest thing to approach your board with. And it's also at times not very easy for anybody to have it's not easy for the board to talk to the president about it because they don't want to scare him or her off. But the need is very much for the conversation to be had about what is the succession plan, not only for the president role, but for other key roles in the organization, and how deep is the bench for those particular roles. That usually doesn't get asked enough. So the sticky ones are leadership style, succession planning, and then the third one I'd offer is board engagement. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it where the CEO or the president believes the board, I think, is being engaged in the right way. I give them all the information they ask for. The board meetings seem to run smoothly, but yada, yada, yada. And then you ask the board, and they're having a completely different experience. So those can be sticky conversations as well. And Alexander, maybe you see there's another
I do.
contribution in the chat box there.
I do. And I had on a prior slide referred to 9 categories of performance evaluation, and I'd be happy to circulate what those 9 were, but it reflects these that you see on slide 6 and then some. There are a number of areas that can and should be considered. Obviously, there are more than 9 on this page, but generally, we want a well-balanced review. And so you could cull 9 out of these, but if you want specifically the 9 that we had originally identified, I'll be happy to share them. So, in talking, in sort of a good segue to this slide is what we've just been discussing, which is what are the sticky points? What can be difficult to discuss? And I think the other side of that coin is what's the best way to gather information? The most common approach, I would say generally, are surveys. That's what a lot of institutions look at. They send something out, it gets collected, it gets organized, it gets shared. But increasingly, and particularly in certain cases, we find that interviews provide a much deeper and richer feedback mechanism, both for someone to sort of share their ideas, but also for us to dig deeper into things that they say. Clearly, there's an opportunity for hybrid approaches, but it's important to think about from whom are you asking feedback, what are you asking them, and what's the best way to get good data. Peter, what's your view on the question of surveys versus interviews and how the people on the call today might think about that?
Yeah, I'd be wary of any evaluation that was completely survey or tool based. I think at minimum, the hybrid approach that we put on here is a good one. And the reason is, think of it just in pragmatic terms. Each of us on this webinar have probably been asked to fill out feedback for a colleague, a boss, subordinates, whatever the case may be in a performance management system, right? So there you are, you're filling out the survey, you're clicking the buttons, you're giving ratings. Then it says open-ended question time, right? You probably have 10 other things you'd rather be doing at that moment than typing out a very thoughtful response to the question. So the reason we suggest at least a hybrid is that sometimes you just need to talk to real people in real time and ask them to describe for you what working with this individual is like. What is their style? How do they engage the board? How do they seem to engage the staff? All these things, it gives people opportunity in the interview, whether it's hybrid or whether you do a lot of interviews with all the board or just a committee of the board. And then the question, of course, about staff, same question, is it all survey driven or some qualitative interviews? We think that the greatest amount of learning, positive learning for the presidents in these evaluation processes is when the data includes some of the qualitative data that you get from interviews. And it's done anonymously. You don't share the results with direct quotes. You don't identify the people who said it. Of course, you take all the qualitative input you get from interviews and any write-in comments, and you do a thorough content analysis of it so that you can pull out the themes that are backed by data. So strong recommendation to include some qualitative interviews as a part of the process.
So we have another question in the chat regarding the qualitative input. Many institutions have deeply important mission, vision elements that factor into assessment, faith-based, minority serving, etc. How do we establish metrics for performance around culture and mission that give sufficient appropriate weight when things like enrollment or endowment are so much easier to quantify? I think that's an excellent question, and it's also why it is important to consider both metrics and this element of leadership assessment, because there is what are you achieving and how are you realizing those strategic aims, but the how and where you are focused is critical. And so when you identify the categories and you go through the interview guide or the survey question or however you're going to deliver that, drafting the question itself is important. What are we trying to get at? What are we trying to learn in asking this question? And being able to use the feedback that you get, whether it be interviews or through a survey, in conjunction with what you actually achieved is important. If mission, for whatever reason, or culture is a high priority, that's going to be weighted more heavily in the evaluation, but that all comes out, I would say, indirectly. It comes out up front when you're designing the evaluation. Of these 10 areas, these 4 are most important, and here's why. You collect that data, and then when you're reviewing the results, again, you go back to those 4 and you say, well, these were the high priority areas. Let's see where they fall relative to the whole. And so you do need to have several inputs and good understanding and alignment to be able to address that thoughtfully, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, I would add, and I put an answer in the chat to everyone. The question about establishing metrics around culture. If your institution has engagement surveys as part of a regular process, which we think is a good idea, you can include that, because even though engagement surveys can suffer from all the things we've been talking about in terms of popularity / qualitative input only, it does give you an indication. Glassdoor is not a good indication, because that's it's fraught with those who have an axe to grind and are not comfortable actually giving the information directly or through the appropriate channels. So it's tough to deal with that. But if you have, regular engagement surveys, that will give you some cultural component to this. You can look at turnover in key positions. Are there, for example, not all turnover is created equal, right? There are some times where turnover is the right kind of turnover, where the person was either no longer effective in the role or for other reasons. Then there's the regretted turnover of a highly effective professor or department chair or staff member in the admin function. And if you have multiple beloved people who are suddenly leaving under a certain president's tenure, that's a good, yellow flag, so to speak, to take a look deeper at where is that coming from. And then also your ability to attract new faculty, new key managerial staff in the admin functions. If you're having trouble hiring people and getting them to come to your place, obviously you can always point to salary or the financial things as the reason why you're not as competitive. But it could be something going on reputationally where people are not, the reputation out there is not what you'd like it to be. So that's what NPS is referring to, which is Net Promoter Scores. You can include those in your engagement surveys. Would you recommend to a friend of yours to apply for a job here? Things of that nature. If you build them into your existing measures, that can be incorporated into all this other data that we've been talking about as the potential for inclusion in the president evaluation.
Yeah, I think that a focus on culture and nurturing the right culture is going to become a more important priority for institutions going forward than it has been in the past. I also think that even with respect to the idea of quantifying these things, I would say, and this is an overarching statement, that with respect to this kind of evaluation, you're trying to get your arms around things that by their nature are difficult to quantify, if they're even able to be quantified or need to be quantified. And so comprehensive evaluation aims to blend the endowment and the enrollment that's easy to quantify with the leadership characteristics that are important but more challenging to necessarily put a number to the extent that's necessary.
Good. Okay. So, in the interest of time, I think we should move on to a couple of the other parts of what we were getting at here, Alexander. So,
Yeah,
you can see timing and cadence here. Why don't you go ahead?
I mean, annual evaluations are a given. You should be doing an evaluation annually to some extent. And beyond that, the most common is doing something prior to a contract renewal, which we see often but not explicitly. Uh, Pulse checks are usually as needed, generally coming out of something that is not necessarily positive, but pulse checks can be utilized. We often get a question of, should evaluation occur more frequently than annually? And that is not something that we are seeing a lot of for a whole host of reasons, but it is a question that we get. Milestone or event-driven reviews are very rare, but we have seen them from time to time. Less so about a president's performance and more so evaluating the efficacy of the campaign or the accreditation cycle or what the case may be, particularly if something didn't go as well as planned, but also to highlight successes in order to improve things going forward.
Yeah, the trick around any kind of milestone or event driven is the wrong time to do an evaluation is when the president, had a bad encounter or a bad event happened or something misfortunate happened, unfortunate happens. Because what that does is that weaponizes the performance evaluation process. You would deal with the issue at the time, but don't drag the performance evaluation into it to be a solve for it. So don't like suddenly get 360 feedback done for purposes of performance evaluation after something unfortunate happens. That's the wrong way to use presidential evaluation. And you'd be surprised. We do get asked at times, how do we handle it when we have this problem? And the answer is not to take an annual process and make it off cycle. You can do, I'd say I'd seen something a little differently than Alexander mentioned, but a mid-year check-in is a good idea. But I would call it a light check-in. It's not a popularity contest, but it's a progress against goals. What are
Mhm.
we seeing? What do we think the rest of the year is going to look like? What is the board seeing? What is the president seeing? A good mid-year short check-in against goals is a good idea.
I agree with that entirely. It doesn't require a whole full-throated evaluation mid-year, but I agree entirely that having that check-in to touch base has proven very helpful to many clients.
It's just like you would do with any manager and their employee. I mean, presidents are no different. They have a boss called the board, right? And this is like the mid-year check-in with your manager to see how things are going in general. No different than the president role.
And so this slide begins to talk through the roles in the process. Like I said earlier, I think it's important that the appropriate subcommittee drive the process. I think it's important that there be open discussion with the president as to what that's going to look like, so everything is transparent and we understand what we're asking, how we're asking it, and the timing of the evaluation. I think that it is important that once those results come in, those results can be shared with the president. They can be shared with the oversight committee so that the chair and the vice chair can understand the perspectives of board leadership. But I don't think that the process ends there. I think it's important for the board chair, the vice chair, and the president, or whomever you determine to be best, to sit down and talk about the results, talk about the perspective of the committee, and align on what's being said, how important is it, what to do about it, and how to go about it. And then ultimately, I think it's really important for the whole evaluation in a summarized fashion to be shared with the board. Because if the board is going to take time to fill out an evaluation, it's important to share what board members are saying. I'll give you a good example of this. We had an institution that used a survey as a component of their evaluation process. It was using a 5-point evaluation scale. Half of the board was giving the president 2s and 3s. Half of the board was giving the president 4s and 5s. Well, when you looked at the overall scores, it looked good. But when you broke it down among the board, it was very clear that there were divergent opinions among the board members regarding performance and, more importantly, the strategy of the institution. And so that was less about the president and more a question of why is the board or members of the board in such a different place? And that led to a different set of conversations to understand that dynamic, because a president cannot be both a 1 and a 5 at the same time.
I think the one other thing I'd add real quickly here, the third bullet on this slide 10 of the presidential discussion coming first. This is under the no surprises rule, right? There should be alignment on it. And the important piece there is to keep the process developmental rather than punitive, right? Because what you want is you want the right data and the right information to be discussed. You want it to be expansive in its scope, hence the open the aperture that we had said before. And obviously the results get factored into compensation decisions for goal achievement at the end of the year. But you also want to, you get better ROI out of the whole process if you also have some goals that the board and the president agree on are developmental in nature. And it doesn't mean that they're fixing a problem, but if it's saying, here's where you were as a president of this institution this year with all the good and all the other developmental opportunities, and to take your game to an even higher level because you're already, especially when the president's already high performing, right? We all have something we can learn to do better. All of us do. So presidents are no different. And so a healthy conversation between board, particularly the committee and either the committee and the president or the board chair and the president can have a robust discussion about that. So there should be some value developmentally for going forward that comes out of this process.
So a few takeaways. You want to do the do's, don't do the don'ts. You want to keep the board strategic. You want to maintain confidentiality. That's important. Context matters, as we've already talked about. You want to keep it developmental and engage in open dialogue. And you want to be able to document these things appropriately so that you can follow up and understand where progress is made or where something may be delayed. This is not about micromanagement. You should not have to micromanage your president. You are not sharing personal remarks or commentary. You don't want to unmask anyone because that will undermine the process for everyone involved. And again, I know I've harped on this, you cannot ignore context. You don't want to have any surprises, as Peter mentioned earlier. And you don't want to treat the evaluation as a one-time thing. This is an ongoing conversation that occurs over time with different stages of understanding. And so if you are successful in realizing the left side and not the right side, you will be on a good path.
I think you touched on all the points here in the last one too, just in our coverage so far. So I guess we have any last questions or things that we can help you with, or if not, the other option is also to put it in the Q&A box, and happy to reach out to either Alexander or I at any other time to answer any more questions that you have.
Yeah, I think I would leave you with the quote on the right-hand side of this screen. And for each institution, it may look a little bit different, but you want to be able to have a thoughtful approach to both the how and the what, so that boards and presidents can continue to lead their institutions successfully over time for their own sake, as well as the campus community, and quite frankly, all of our futures, because you are all educating the future leaders of our world. And so being able to do this effectively is so critical. So if we can't get to all of your questions today, please feel free to reach out to us and email us. Otherwise, we appreciate you being with us today, and we hope you glean something useful from your time spent.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I just want to say thank you to Alex and Peter of Promeyer. I'm Dorian Wanzer, the Director of Communications at NAICU. So thank you both for this important conversation, and thanks to all of you for joining. And please stay tuned for the recording of this webinar. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to our team and we will get in touch. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.